Hey Whappers, welcome in to where tonight's topic is on major world religions. Specifically, we're going to hit Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and a little bit of Christianity, all mixed together. To continue the conversation from class this Thursday, we discussed how with Hinduism and Buddhism, there were similarities and differences. And one of the main differences is social order, how each religion addressed social order. And in terms of social order, Hindus subscribe to the notion of the caste system as a very rigid social hierarchy built into their religious beliefs, and this tied into the idea of karma as well. Meanwhile, Buddhists were a much more inclusive religion, meaning it was a religion that was pledged to include all sorts of people from all different castes, men, women. So by and large, Buddhism had wide appeal, especially amongst lower caste or lower class people, for the fact that Buddhism was open to all. But the one point I want to reinforce, and you're going to hear me say this again later in video tonight, is the monastic lifestyle. Buddhism promoted the idea of stepping away, removing oneself from society in order to find nirvana, to achieve enlightenment. And sometimes that meant withdrawing from the real world and sort of living in isolation or living in small religious villages where the sole purpose is to practice your faith. And this monastic lifestyle is actually where we get the idea of monks. And Buddhism is a classic case of a religion where there's monastic lifestyle. And what's interesting is that, again, because Buddhism was inclusive, Buddhism allowed for both men and women to participate in these monastic orders that formed all over the world. That's a really important characteristic about Buddhism, monasticism. And speaking of Buddhism, I also want to bring up the fact that there are two main types of Buddhism that are practiced today around the world. And these types share a lot of the same things in common: the belief in nirvana, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, monasticism, missionaries, yada, yada, yada. But the two different types of Buddhism are Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana, sorry, it's a little bit of a mouthful there. Mahayana, there we go. So between the two, Theravada Buddhism, they share a lot of similarities, but really the differences just come down to where those religions spread. That's kind of one of the fundamental differences that we need to be aware of for our class. Now, Theravada or Theravada Buddhism spread predominantly from South Asia into Southeast Asia. Places like Myanmar, Thailand, especially Laos. Theravada Buddhism spread mostly to Southeast Asia. And that is where it remains ingrained deeply in the culture of those countries to this day. Meanwhile, Mahayana Buddhism spread mostly throughout East Asia, although it did go to parts of Southeast Asia as well, to Vietnam and Cambodia. But Mahayana primarily spread into China, into Korea, and into Japan. And you can, of course, see this all on the map that's up there right now. But this difference in Buddhism is important because there are different types of Buddhist beliefs. And again, for our class purposes, we do not need to go into the real nuances of these belief systems. But knowing that there are two different types of Buddhism is important. So Buddhism is a religion that's split off into different sort of groups. And really the defining difference there is geography. So that's just one of those topics that is more of like a memorization part that you definitely want to be aware of. But I'm going to switch gears now completely. We're going to do a complete reversal here and go backwards almost in time in order for us to talk about another one of the world's oldest religions, which is Judaism. And Judaism evolved somewhere around the 2000 BCE. So this is back in the Neolithic era sort of time period. But Judaism is to this day one of the more important monotheistic religions anywhere in the world. Judaism is one of the dominant world religions, and it's also one of the oldest. Now, one of the things I really like to stress about Judaism is that followers of Judaism, there's many different names for people who practice Judaism. Jewish is a common name for people who practice Judaism. Sometimes they're also referred to as Hebrews. And another phrase is Israelites. And that refers to the ancient kingdom that existed back in the BCE era. So we can use those terms interchangeably, Jewish, Hebrews, Israelites, to describe people who practice Judaism. And you can see by headline, the OG monotheistic religion. Along with Zoroastrianism, Judaism is one of the oldest monotheistic religions in the entire world. And so that distinguishes it greatly from, for example, Hinduism or Buddhism or any of the Chinese philosophies as well, because monotheistic religions were more outliers. They stood out more for being unique. There are some important fundamentals that we need to just have here with Judaism, and the Torah is the sacred text of the Jewish people. And one of the most important contributions in the Torah that offers guidelines about Jewish lifestyle are the Ten Commandments. And you may have heard of these before, but they come from old, the ancient kind of religious history with Judaism. And the Ten Commandments are one of the integral parts of the Torah. And we can chalk these up to similarities with the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths for Buddhism, other moral codes we talked about, like Ashoka's Rock and Edict Pillars, the Code of Ur-Nammu, the Code of Hammurabi. So, it mirrors the fact that peoples from the BCE era had law and moral codes. But I want to kind of end things to talk especially about the Jewish experiences, which has been well chronicled even in the modern era, and certainly we'll cover some of these topics later. The Jewish people living in the BCE era and during the classical period went through periods of great accomplishments and golden ages to periods of enslavement and persecution. And as a result, this dramatically shaped the people's not only their religious lives, but also their non-religious lives, their political lives. And Jewish people lived throughout most of their history, while they did have their own great thriving kingdoms for many years in the BCE era. For the most part, Jewish people were commonly living under other empires, like the Egyptians, like the Persians with Cyrus the Great, like Alexander, and eventually like the Roman Empire, which we'll start getting into tomorrow. And this is going to really affect and shape the lives of Jewish people, because they don't ever, traditionally in world history, they don't really have their own country. They did have a kingdom for a short period of time, but it didn't last for a while. And so as time persists and we move into the classical era, Jewish people really become people without a home. They don't have their own country. They don't have their own kingdom. They're always conquered or living under other people's rule. Now, some rulers, like Cyrus, offered them toleration. Others, like the Egyptians, for example, enslaved Jewish people. So it really depended on the empire that conquered the Jewish people as to what their situations were going to be. And here's where I'm now going to offer one of the most important vocab words of the week to describe how Jewish people were constantly settling in areas all over Afro-Eurasia because they didn't have a home country. They didn't have a homeland. And the word here is diaspora. And a diaspora is a settlement of people that live outside of their homeland. And this has to be sort of, these diasporas are usually larger, not just like a handful of people. We're talking like, hundreds, thousands of people. But if we think about diasporas as the word and the concept of groups of people living away from their homeland, well, I think that some of you have great experience, and some of you may be even living in an ethnic diaspora here in Washington, D.C., perhaps if your families, came from another country. Diasporas are a growing issue that still affects, countries around the world today. And there's diasporas all over the world of people living in countries other than their own. And as we study later in the year the history of the Jewish people, this is going to take us into conversations, especially when we get to World War II, about the Holocaust. But when we talk about migrations around the world, the Jewish diaspora is one of the more important world migrations that we'll study, because of the fact that this goes back to even the classical era, when Jewish people never had their homeland. They did not have a homeland, and therefore, as a result, they were spread out and moving and setting up diasporas all over Afro-Eurasia. When it comes to Judaism, though, perhaps one of its greatest effects is that it sort of fed into another important monotheistic religion, and that's Christianity. And while we're not going to go into the Christianity in great detail here tonight, we're going to kind of wrap things up shortly. Christianity definitely influenced, Judaism 100% influenced Christianity. In fact, the teachings of Christianity are based on the man, Jesus Christ, who lived and was actually a Jewish person living in the Middle East in the BCE era, and in the early part of the CE era. That's my fault. And Jesus' teachings become the basis of Christianity. And we're going to talk about Christianity's spread, especially when we get into the Roman Empire. And what's important about Christianity, I want to tie this back to Buddhism. Christianity is one of those religions that preached the idea of a monastic lifestyle for both men and women. It was a much more inclusive religion than many other religions. And I think what I want to end sort of on, as we're going to talk in greater detail about Christianity soon, what I really want to sort of end on is this idea that Judaism has a lot of roots in the Christian religion. And that connection is important because it shows that Judaism doesn't just have its own importance in its religion, in its own right, in its own religion, but it also has importance in the sense that it connects to Christianity. And so that certainly sets up a lot of past shapes to the future for us to look at. Okay, I got this in under 15 minutes. Hopefully you find this to be helpful. We're going to go over a little bit more about the religion stuff. We'll recap and make sure to ask those questions and bring those questions tomorrow. And then we're going to start talking about Rome. So hope everyone has a good Thursday evening. As always, remember the past shapes the future. Oh, and go Jets. Big game tonight for the Jets against the Browns. Hopefully they get off to a good start this season and can get to 2-1 tonight. So go Jets. Take care, everybody.